Chris D is here from the Australian National University in Canberra, where he's in the School of Cybernetics. And I think a good way of getting into some of the ways in which the humanities and technology can intersect is by talking just a little bit, I think, about the School of Cybernetics. And I spent a little bit of time there myself, so I know it a little bit. And probably the best way to kind of really get a sense of the School of Cybernetics and the kind of place it is it's in a building called the Birch Building, wonderful kind of modern piece of architecture. And as you go up the stairs in the Birch Building, at the top of the stairs, there is a piece of equipment that every university should have. A random excuse generator.
Yeah.
The random excuse generator is the work of a kind of a lost Irish or an Australian inventor named Henry Hoke. There's a book. Henry Hoke is in turn the work of an artist named Mark Thompson. And the random excuse generator actually works. I tried it out. It has all, as you can see, it's full of kind of knobs and dials and all sorts of things. So you sit down at a seat, which looks like one of those metal seats off an old piece of farming equipment. And you do things like, for instance, you have to calibrate the credibility gap tolerance, right? So you have this here, the credibility gap tolerance. You have to calibrate that. You have to be careful that things like for instance, now this is your credibility gap calibration.
Plausibility level.
Yeah, that's right. This is your implausibility level. You have to check your implausibility levels. There's a credulity strainer in case credulity is strained. So you have to kind of make sure that's working. There is the implausibility level meter. You have to keep an eye on your platitude accumulator. This is showing dangerously high levels here. But when all your equipment is working properly and your platitude accumulator is not in the danger zone, you can then do very valuable things like pull the blame shifter lever, which is always a very useful thing to have. And then of course, if all goes wrong, down underneath it there is a back pedal. So you can always back pedal. So this is what's up as you go up the stairs in the Birch Building, where the School of Cybernetics is located in the Australian National University, where Chris does his work. Tell us a little bit about this, the School of Cybernetics, because it's a really interesting model for thinking about how people like us in universities can interact with colleagues from other disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think Mark's work just shows, how central playfulness is, to the schools. So, something we need to. Yeah, so the school was set up in 2022, and Mark is one of the artists in residence. So one thing we have is an artist in residency program. But the school was set up by Genevieve Bell, and she's now actually she's left as director, is now the vice chancellor of Heaney, so she's become the boss of the whole university. And it was set up to think about how we navigate sort of through complex systems that involve sort of technology, humans. For me, very much non-human animals and the environment. So, we're sort of living in this kind of tech-saturated world, and cybernetics comes from the Greek word for steersman. So it sort of it implies this idea of steering through a difficult system, and how we sort of think about this sort of tech-saturated present in terms of. And for me, it's about sort of separating out how does technology relate to the human, how does it relate to the non-human animal, how does it relate to the environment? Because I think something we do very much is just sort of see them all collapsing together. And so we're trying to use various different means, and one of them is kind of playful artistic means. I think something that Mark's artwork really shows is cyberneticians are great tinkerers, and they love to sort of build machines that operate in the world. I was just telling Chris before we came on is that if you Google random excuse generator, you can actually get to a website that will actually generate. It's not related to this project. It's just a sort of one of those terrible sites you get onto. Because I was thinking, let's look up Mark's work a bit, and but something that this gives you kind of physical experience of it, doesn't it? You actually sit. It's like you're sitting on a bicycle. You have to, you get a bit pick while you're doing it, and so we, I think cybernetics is really about how we experience ourselves physically in the
Yeah,
world, and,
yeah,
and how we relate to the environment, technology, and it's all becoming so overwhelming at the moment.
yeah,
And so,
yeah,
and how we have methods of, one way to do it is to actually, a big part of the methodology of the school is looking at the past, how we can use the past to understand
mm,
the present. So Genevieve's working with colleague Andrew Mears about Chris is on this project too, about the Australian Telegraph. How do we think of engineering systems from the past helping us to understand the present? So yeah,
yeah.
these sort of different methodologies.
Yeah, and behind something like the random excuse generator, I mean, there's a kind of serious idea as well,
Mm,
and it goes to something I think I think we're all particularly interested at the moment, and that is when you use the random excuse generator and you set all your dials and you calibrate your incredulity and do all that, an excuse comes up. You know, I had no idea that the decision would have those consequences. You know, or something as simple as I slept in. You never quite know what you're going to get, but you have a kind of peculiar sensation that it's sentient,
uh-huh.
that it's telling you something, uh, that there is a kind of a mind at work there. And yet at the same time, because you know it's a joke, because the whole thing is there's an ironic aspect to it, you also know it's not. That it's just there is a display which will produce literally random excuse, no matter what you do with the rest of the machine. Um, and I think to me that kind of gets me to something that I think is interesting in your own work, and one of the ways that your work I think intersects with a lot of what's going on in school cybernetics, and that is how we think about other minds,
Hmm.
and how we think about minds that are not human.
Hmm.
You've written about this in relation to animal fables. I want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So before I came to the school, I wrote a book called Animal Fables After Darwin, which is
Hmm.
the starting point of that book. Is that after Darwin proposed this theory of evolution that connecting humans to animals, people started writing stories, that very much made that point, that that humans are another form of animal,
Yeah.
and also that one of the things the book tries to establish is that fabulous are kind of mythologists. They're really interested. Like, we have this very sort of stereotypical idea of the fables that they're just, these animals are just standing in for human characters and they have nothing to do with animals. But I was trying to show that for a lot of writers about animals, they're actually really interested in how animals think, and they want to sort of
Mm.
show how animal behavior gets manifested
Mhm.
um, in in the sort of interactions with humans. And something that connects it with cybernetics, and is that the starting point of cybernetics is kind of this idea that machines imitate life, right? So the machines sort of have, respond to their environment, have sensory, sort of have organs, have sensory sort of inputs and outputs. And so in the 1940s, when Norbert Wiener was proposing cybernetics, he sort of said there's this analogy we can make between machines and humans. And so my work has really been interested in how, and this is, I think, something we're getting from the
Mm.
random excuse generator, is it's imitating a kind of
Mm.
response that someone, it's almost like you're interacting with another person. And so, my work has sort of moved on from how we see animals as sort of intelligent, non-human interlocutors, to seeing machines
Yeah.
as sort of intelligent, non-human locutors. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that literature can do, and I think your work has shown that, is it allows us to ask, what do we mean when we say something is intelligent?
Hmm.
What do we mean by intelligence? What do we mean when we say it has mind? And I think one of the things you've shown is that literature provides us one of the ways of thinking about that. The book you edited with Helen Gross,
Ellen Groff.
yeah,
Yep.
Helen Groff, Mindful Aesthetic,
Mm.
which takes that as a starting point. How do we, how do we imagine the minds of others? You know,
Mm.
is that what literature does? Is that the thing that keeps us going back to novels, for
Mhm.
instance? You know,
Mm.
it's a curious thing to do, read books about people that never existed. Okay, think about it.
Mhm.
Is it that it allows us access to the minds of others to think about the way others think? Um, because this goes to one of the real questions at the moment in terms of machines and particularly artificial intelligence, is that maybe we've been asking the wrong questions when we've been asking what is artificial intelligence. that there's well, the test for a long time, for the last 70 odd years, since 1950, in the Turing test, where where Alan Turing basically said, okay, well, a machine has intelligence if you are interacting with machine X and human being Y, and you can't tell the difference. Um, that assumes that the only way of thinking is the way that human beings think. And I think you've been picking up some of those ideas as well. I mean,
Yeah,
particularly in
something.
the mindful aesthetic book.
Yeah, something. I mean, something that's interesting is, one of my core interests is anthropomorphism. We talk a lot about anthropomorphism. I mean, something. So what we do, with often inanimate things, we bring them to life. So one of the that sort of cognitive question with, say, with animals, it's much easier to imagine, a mind behind it. But how do you do that with machine? How do we do it with artificial intelligence? And something that I've been thinking about is anthropomorphism is kind of a way of connecting us to other things, right? But it doesn't necessarily speak for that other thing. So, what we do when we anthropomorphize, give human characteristics to something, we might sort of connect. So we might connect ourselves to a machine like the random excuse generator, but we don't necessarily then go, well, it necessarily thinks this way or that way. And it can actually be quite, it can be silent. And that silence can then make us think, what does it mean to think? Who are we? So I'm quite interested in these kind of, I don't know how you describe, maybe partial anthropomorphisms. But, people are doing that today. So, ChatGPT, it's sort of, it's alive because it talks and it gives, intelligent responses. But in some sense, it's also not a human
Mhm.
mind, is it? So
Yeah,
it's sort of
exactly.
like there's a kind of silence behind every answer that ChatGPT gives you. Is a kind of silence, of a non-human
Yeah.
response. Like,
Yeah.
and so that can get us to think, well, how do we think about ourselves then? How does,
Yeah.
and I mean, this is a sort of response as well to your question. I've never written on this, but I've wondered, like, what happens if we thought of literary characters as kind of non-human,
Mhm.
even if they're
Mhm.
human beings,
Mhm. Yeah.
and I mean, people I think are starting to write about that, but what I mean, it's an interesting question is that, there's this kind of character there that you sort of start to empathize with. But what happens if it's partial, that
Yeah.
process, and there's sort
Yeah.
of something there that, yeah,
Yeah.
it's an
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah. Yeah. No,
problem.
it is an interesting problem. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Because, it's back to the chat GPT that we think of it as being intelligent because it interacts with us like a person.
Mm.
Um, and it may be that the problem with that is that our definition of intelligence is to behave like human. But there's a loop there,
Mm. Mm.
and that perhaps there are ways of thinking, and this is where your work with animals is so interesting because the animals raise the same issue as machines, or an analogous one. Um, that there are completely other ways of thinking. One of the books I've been sort of reading on this is James Bridle's Beyond Human Intelligence, and where he's posing this sort of comparison between the machine thought and animal thought. And he gives the example of we've talked about this, of the octopus. Yeah? That octopuses are known to be intelligent. Yeah, there's the famous example of the one that was in an aquarium in New Zealand that got out its own overflow pipe, crawled along the floor with no water, went up a wall, and got onto a 106-foot pipe that led to the ocean and slid down it and got away. Now, I mean, that's Steve McQueen stuff. I mean, that's a smart octopus. Yeah. The only thing is, like other cephalopods, the octopus doesn't have a brain as such. That it has a series of kind of neural networks that are in various parts of its body. They're not all in the head. They're not a single brain like we have. That it's a kind of dispersed neural network system. Now it obviously thinks, but it obviously thinks in ways that are completely different from the way we think. And if we attribute to it human ways of thinking, we're anthropomorphizing it.
Mm.
But we're perhaps missing out on what's really interesting is what is it that allows it to think like that. And I mean, in your book on animal fables after Darwin, this pulled with the library, you use the example of walking upright.
Uh-huh.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
As a
Yeah, I'm really interested in sort of what I call orientational metaphors. So,
Mm.
these are, the linguist Lakoff and Johnson sort of proposed this idea that we have, often we map concepts spatially, right? So we might say, well, an example they give is happy's up. So you think, I'm feeling up today, that, you're happy. And so in this book, I was trying to use the orientational metaphor to think about how we think about what it means to be human. So the human is up too. So we see ourselves as erect, we walk upright. There's all these philosophers that say what distinguishes the human is this sort of erect posture, and we, we look up to heaven. Heaven is above. All these concepts, and the corresponding one for animals, of course, is animals are down. Animals on the earth, and even though there's contradictions, like Adam was, in the biblical story of Genesis, Adam was kind of came out of the earth and so on. But largely we see animals as down, and sort of a pejorative sense of being down, a positive sense of being up. And so I think there's really interesting ways of, and these are spatial ways of thinking about the human. And at the moment, I'm sort of the kind of in this new project, Future Fables, about thinking about how maybe we're the surrounded and machines are the surroundings. That sort of there's a kind of different kind of orientational metaphor with our relation to machines, because I think an intuition I have is that we tend to not think very well spatially, even though we. And so what's amazing about the octopus, say, is the way it has a kind of spatial intelligence. Does that?
That's right.
And
Yeah.
and what I find interesting, say, about that website, when you go onto the internet and sort of come up with a random excuse, generator, like this physical experience is so much richer, isn't it? So how do we think of the human in relation to the machine in a more kind of spatial way? But these kind of orientational metaphors of the human.
Okay. Yeah. And again, that's going back to the idea of thought as embodied. And again, if the only way we can think about thought is in human terms, then we're embodying it in these bodies that we have, as opposed to something with 8 arms and suction cups. That I mean, you write about this I think in relation to H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. That this is imagining a thought of different bodies.
Yeah, I mean, they're a big brain, aren't they?
Yeah.
The Martians. So that's maybe not a hugely imaginative kind of idea of an alien. But yeah, so like one of the dangers of anthropomorphism is if you go too far, then everything starts to. People have said that. Why do aliens always seem pretty much humanoid?
Yeah.
And the Martians in that case are kind of just big brains. And something I'm really interested in a writer now, Jeff Vandermeer, who does this really interesting work where he Area X is a sort of just a totally disembodied sort of intelligence. It's kind of it's a life form that seems to be sort of taking over this sort of area in Florida, but no one knows. It doesn't sort of have. It's not centralized.
Right.
It's sort of
Right.
And so Vandermeer is very interested in. So how do we imagine kind of different kinds of alien intelligence? So getting away from this. So this is now we're talking about the dangers of anthropomorphism, where things are too human shaped, and then and I think there's a real benefit to Vandermeer will talk, say, for example, about how do birds navigate the magnetic fields, so like how can they go thousands and thousands of kilometers, navigate their way home, and how do we appreciate that kind of intelligence, or the octopus's intelligence? So there's a kind of wonder, like I think literature is so equipped to express the wonder of those kind of alien intelligence that are both near us and actually from outer space.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, it kind of makes you think. Okay, well, if we take the example of animals, that if we're anthropomorphizing animals, we have for years and years and years told ourselves stories about animals as if they were human, as if they thought like us at some level. And at some level, we tend to, I think, quite often interact with real animals like that. I mean, at one point, I was convinced my dog could talk. That she could say her name. She could say, "No, that's great." She could say her name, the talking dog. But then I started to think, well, that's probably that's as far as she's ever going to get. I gave her a treat when she did it. I'm asking the wrong question. Really, I should be learning dog language. What does it mean when when the tail goes a certain way, or when she sniffs my bum, is that, I mean, that kind of thing is really the dog language. And I suppose it raises the question that if with animals we have done this for millennia, we have tried to make the animals human. Yeah. And there's a serious point in that if we tried to make the animals human, are we now doing the same thing with machines? And that all of the energy that's going into artificial intelligence is actually just a kind of repeat
Mm.
of what we did with animals for millennia, just to make the machines human-like.
Mm.
Um,
No, I think that's right. I think we are, and we're sort of yeah, we want, because we associate sort of, the idea of language with the
yeah,
mind. So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
if
yeah,
ChatGPT speaks to us, it sort of,
yeah,
has
yeah,
a mind. And again, I think it's, for me, there's a challenge in how do we think about machines as kind of social
mm,
actors,
yeah, yeah,
and I think that's something very much when you have a pet, you realize
yeah,
that this is another kind of being and
yeah,
one that you have to interact with certain ways. So
yeah, yeah,
when I take my dog for a walk, how he interacts with
yeah,
other, you have to sort of be respectful for that,
yeah,
or that sort of way of being. And we're definitely not, I think we're too focused. My sense is we're too focused on the technical capacity. So if we
mhm,
say, well, what is AI?
yeah,
It's often down to, well, it has human like
yeah,
responses,
yeah,
or it can chat, or it can
yeah,
formulate intelligent responses that someone will think maybe be generated um, by another human. But we're also actually in the world with these things. And so
mhm,
how do we, people have asked me when I give talks, they say, well,
yeah,
what do you think about
mm,
breaking, Siri or ChatGPT, the way that people try to
mm,
to sort of to give to release the sort of inappropriate responses
yeah,
that
yeah,
these
yeah,
things are
yeah,
being much more closely protected. My first thought is, why do you want to do that?
yeah.
Like,
Okay.
well, if you're interacting with
Yes,
something, why do you want
yes,
to break
yeah,
it? Why do you
yeah,
want to sort of act like a sort
yeah,
of turn into a slave,
yeah,
or master it, or
yeah,
and but yeah, so yeah, there's a sort of strange thing of that. There's two things going on. We both humanize it, but then, or in order to enslave it almost, or to
mhm,
sort of treat it badly,
yeah.
which is what we often do with animals too. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, to go back to James Bridle, when he talks about animals and our interactions with animals, he says basically you can break down our interactions with animals over millennia into three categories. They've either been pets, in which case we've kind of anthropomorphized them, befriended them, they've been domesticated, in which case they've become effectively sort of tools, or they're wild, in which case we fear them, they're dangerous. And that essentially, with technology, we're repeating
mm,
that we have pet technologies that are our friends that we're not really afraid of, that live in our homes. We have like domesticated technologies that do things, um, and now with artificial intelligence, and there are other technologies as well, we begin to think of them as wild. You know,
mhm,
and maybe we need to kind of say, well, not none of those three relations are ideal,
mhm.
and that is there another way of thinking our relation with machines by rethinking our relation with animals?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one way, I guess, yeah, one way we think
Mhm,
of machines as kind of wild is that sort of fantasy, which is the starting point
mhm,
of this project, that AI
mm,
is going to take over.
yeah,
There's this
yeah,
sort of idea.
yeah,
So the current project I'm doing sort of starts again in the time of Darwin and says, this fear that we have that AI is going to become sentient and sort of take over. Like the sort of paperclip problem that people talk
yeah,
about. There's a famous example where if you ask AI to maybe produce paper clips, right? It will then yeah, well, we don't need, in order to produce paper clips, I'll just wipe all the people out of the earth and just produce paper clips. So there's all these apocalypse scenarios. And there's kind of this idea, isn't it? Yeah, that's gone
yeah,
wild.
yeah, yeah,
And, we need to think, and that fear actually, this is the project that I'm working on at the moment, begins at the time of Darwin, where writers like Samuel Butler and George Eliot actually said, well, what happens if machines start evolving? So that evolutionary
mhm,
paradigm was applied from animals to and the biological order to the
yeah.
machine order. But yeah, so I don't
And they're
agree
both
that
emerging at the same time.
yeah.
It's that period in the second half of the 19th century
Mm,
that the evolutionary model begins to kind of get hardwired into the way people think. You get like Herbert Spencer, who are kind of hardwiring that into the way people think about society as evolving, human beings as evolving morally, ethically, socially, politically,
mm,
um, but also, as you said, machines as well.
mm. And I mean, something
Mm,
to say there, what's very interesting is that, this idea, it's not Darwin's expression, but, this,
mm,
the survival of the fittest. I mean,
mm,
it's that model, like biologists are now actively going against it. I mean, this can
yeah,
offer a model for,
yeah,
machine relations, saying there's much more cooperation in
yeah,
nature than
yeah,
we actually think. So we have these kind of, you know, paradigms of, that things, this idea of AI wiping us out is sort of the idea of the survival of the fittest, isn't
Yeah.
it? But I mean, we can cooperate. I mean, we can relate.
Yeah.
We can. So one of the expressions we have in the school is humans in the loop. Like we are constantly in a relation with our technology. Not to say that we're co-evolving with that
Mm.
technology, but so we definitely need, I think, more positive paradigms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's cybernetic provides a way of thinking where we're thinking in terms of systems,
Mhm.
systems of communication and control, but not so much, I suppose, in the system itself, but what it does, what it
Mm.
accomplishes. Um, and there's some wonderful examples, I think, from the early history of cybernetics, people using animals in the animal
Mm.
world. Think that a great example of that early cyberneticist.
Gray Walter, is that with the
Oh,
tortoises?
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
you're talking about Gray Walter.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Gray Walter was this
yeah.
guy in the 1940s. He sort of built these, robotic tortoises, which were essentially very simple robots that sort of had light sensors on them that they would be attracted to light. And they also had something built in is when they bumped into something, they would immediately sense that they bumped into something and back
Mm.
away from it. So it created this sort of fairly randomized movement. Then they would sort of head towards something and head away from it. And yeah, you can sort of see this kind of both the playfulness of that and,
Mhm.
the sort of using, he called them tortoises, sort of imagining them as animals. And,
Mm.
like I think one of the key things about cybernetics and this like undecidable questions is so the cybernetics begins by saying, well, there's an analogy between humans and machines. So which way do we take that analogy?
Yeah.
And I think it's really undecidable. Like, are machines more
Mhm.
biological? Or are humans more machine-like? And I like to go the first way.
Yeah,
I think it's
yeah,
a more playful
yeah.
way, and that sort of, again, that sort of exploration of the world through the creation of a kind of artificial. Well, and I mean, one point I would say, I haven't done much work on this, but social robotics. I see cybernetics as kind of the basis of social robotics. Social robotics is a
Mm.
new field of robotics now that like looks at how we can produce robots that generate that improve social feeling. That
Yeah.
that can be used in therapy and so on. And I think these early cybernetic experiments are very much the precursors of that this
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
field of
yeah,
social robotics.
yeah.
Mm.
And there's an ethics to this as well.
Mm.
That if we think of humans as machine-like as opposed to the other way around, um, that can lead all sorts of places. With
Mhm.
a machine is a tool. It's there to be manipulated. You find how to push the right buttons. You can make the machine do what it wants. Um, that you're into areas of controlling other humans. You
Mm.
think of them as machine-like. Whereas if you reverse that and say, well, machines can be human-like
Mm.
or animal-like.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the example I was thinking of an early cyberneticist was named Stafford Beer,
Mhm.
who was implicitly hired by the United Steel Company in the U.S. to design a better factory, design a factory where all the pieces interact with each other. And he thought, okay, what's the model of something where all the bits interact? And he thought a pond, like a pond, has insects, it has fish, and it has plants, and it has algae, and all these things. So he built a great big pond in his basement. And he was designing a factory for a steel factory, like designing a steel factory based on a pond. And he kept
Mm.
adding things and taking things away. Now, the factory never got built. Eventually, United Steel said, "Oh, okay, this isn't going to work." But there was a serious idea there that, to think about how, for instance, a pond is relatively self-regulating. If it gets too warm, if there's not enough water, if there's too much water, if there's too much of one thing, too little of another, the pond regulates that.
Mm.
And to think about how a system can do that.
Mm.
And it's that kind of systems thought that I think makes cybernetics really
Yeah, I
interesting.
mean, homeostasis is, so even if you don't know what cybernetics is, you would know concepts that are cybernetical, like feedback.
Yeah,
Is one,
yeah.
sort of where, the idea of cybernetics as sort of steering is, if you imagine you're steering a boat to a location, you sort of get
Mm.
blown off course a bit, and then you change the rudder and you steer back on course. I mean, that's using negative feedback. You sort of, to get to your goal. So the idea, one way to think of cybernetics is a sort of goal-oriented behavior that sort of uses negative feedback to achieve the arrival goal. And homeostasis is another one. It's sort of this way that systems can maintain themselves. And so, the Gaia principle,
Yeah.
which I'm very fond of, is poetry work and sort of the environmental humanities. The idea that somehow the Earth as a system is a kind of homeostatic device.
Mm.
Sort of, I mean, I like that idea that somehow it sort of modifies. And the idea of this era that we're in, the Anthropocene, is that somehow that system's been knocked out of balance,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and how So one of the ways that we need cybernetics is sort of how can we steer things back? I mean, it's very idealistic, but I think it's important.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. And it looks at the relationship between humans and machines as sort of deeply meshed, yeah, as opposed to saying, okay, let's just go develop a machine, yeah, or let's just look at human society. And I think this is where the kind of thing that in universities, helping people like ourselves in humanities interacting with people in engineering and sciences, that becomes really important. That you look at how those things interact. You mentioned earlier that the project in the School of Cybernetics in ANU, the Australian Overland Telegraph project that
Mm.
Genevieve Bell and Andrew Mayer's been working on. I that had a little bit of involvement with that. And I spent some time in the outback with them, tracing this line of this 1872 telegraph right through the middle of the outback. And what's fascinating there is how what is a technical system, a system for sending a message electronically, um, connect with all sorts of other things. So you're building a telegraph through a desert in the 1870s. You need to transport wires and poles. Now, most people doing this are English and Scottish engineers, and English and Scottish people are good at very many things. But camel herding is probably not something they're known for. You don't need horses; the horses are going to die. You need camels. You need camel herders. So they um, hired a group of people they call Afghans. They're really from kind of now northern Pakistan to be the camel herders, who were Muslims. So they built mosques for themselves. They brought camels. A lot of the camels, or some of the camels, went wild, went feral. You've got lots of desert, not too many predators. Not something usually said about Australia, but not too many predators for camels. Um, and there are now traces of these early moss scattered through bits of South Australia and into the Northern Territories. There are wells that are built the same way wells are built in Afghanistan. And there are something like 100,000 feral camels. Now, that's the result of building a technological system, a communication system, in many ways, the cursor of the contemporary internet. And that's a completely unintended consequence. So
Mm.
all these systems are interconnected. So it's not just that the animal and the machine are analogous, but they're also linked.
Mm. Mm.
And I mean that's
Yeah,
work in your
seeing
school. Yeah.
complex systems. I mean, we have an expression in school, just sort of seeing a system. Like, how are these complex things interacting? And I think, as any kind of discipline we're involved, my primary one is literature. We're always thinking like, how can we generate or an understanding of the most complexity that we can think of? But often that's not enough. So I mean, the way the school's been set up is that we have people from lots of different disciplines. We have physicists, we have computer scientists, we have anthropologists, sociologists, photographers, and the idea is if we can get lots of different people into the room, how can we sort of get sort of good solutions to these kind of complex problems? Because you can only see as far as your disciplinary limit. And there was a really interesting discussion about the medical humanities yesterday and how you bring your discipline into it, but yeah, you often need to have those kind of extra perspectives to help. And so the idea of the school is how can we see these problems better by bringing more
Mm.
sort of different disciplines in. And that's how Cybernetics kind of began as the Macy's conferences, so people in different disciplines
Yeah.
coming together. And also Norbert Wiener said that it was not about applying engineering solutions to
No.
social problems. It's like the social sciences and the humanities have their own methodologies that we need to take into account too. So yeah.
And what's your sense of what you bring to the table as a literary scholar?
Mm.
Like when you're sitting around with your colleagues, you're the engineers and the computer scientists and the photographers, and what is it literature does that allows us to think systems in this way?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is an appreciation of metaphor.
Okay.
Sort of the sense in which, for me, that founding, the idea of the machine as a sort of, as a sort of biological organism is a sort of metaphor. ChatGPT, even
Mhm.
that word chat. I
Yeah.
mean, we just
Yeah. Yeah.
these things are so embedded. So that reading of language, like, what does it mean to say, yeah, we're just chatting,
Yeah. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
I think the literary scholar, that attention to language, to metaphor, um, and I think also this session on the medical humanities made me think. I think we're quite good at formulating thematic um, focuses.
Mhm.
So I think something that's guided me in my career is just going from one theme to another. So human animal relations, human machine relations.
Mhm.
The co like a project I want to sort of develop in the school, the co-evolution of humans and machines.
Right.
How can we look at that from an interdisciplinary perspective? And
Mhm.
that's and you find it in the literature that we read. So the literature is so rich that it gives you this kind of material. But
Mhm.
then you need to pursue, I mean, there's lots more to say, sort of storytelling,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
sense of what's so
How we
rich about this is
narrativize.
the
Yeah.
backstory, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the sort of the long story, the hoax that's sort of behind these,
Yeah.
that sort of sensitivity to things, even humor. I think
Mm.
there's something about,
Mm.
using comedy. I've been doing work with Genevieve about the phonograph and using as a kind of comic, as a
Mhm.
kind of comical device to bring out its sort of the social dimension of
Yeah.
technology. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's lots of different
Yeah.
ways.
And this, I mean, and this is some of the work that you did in the mindful aesthetics book as well, because they you sort of think about this. Is it also something that literature allows us to think the mind of others?
Mm,
And if we can do that, we can think about questions like intelligence
mm,
differently.
mm. Yeah, it's something that it's not exactly what you're talking about. It's something that
Yeah.
this is at the very beginning, like of this project. There's a writer, John Coetzee, has a really interesting anecdote. He says he's got an old rusty car in his garage,
Mhm.
and he says the point of the story is he just can't get rid of it. And he goes, "There's other people who feel like this. It doesn't work, it doesn't function, but he sort of feels like it's a friend."
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that's really interesting. Is like
Mhm.
somehow friendship is expressed through this relation to the kind of completely defunct rusty car. So what he's doing there, it's an act of sympathy. He's imagining his way into at least the relationship with that car,
Yeah.
isn't it? And so I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
writers do that. They sort of how do we think our way into a relationship, with something, even if it's something as non-human as a car. But of course, yeah. I mean, writers are constantly imagining what it's like to be another person,
Mhm.
um, and yeah, thinking about what it means to be human by through that act of sympathy. Yeah.
Mm.
So I think sympathy is a way to think through this relation we have with machines. So we
Mhm.
have this, the Terminator model,
Yeah.
isn't it, of
Yeah.
technology.
Yeah.
But what happens if we use sympathy as a model rather than
Mm.
annihilation or something?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's something that the novelist Paul Lynch said when he on Booker last year with Prophet Song. He described the book as a kind of exercise in radical empathy.
Mm,
Um, and what would it be like to be that person?
mm,
Um, and it started me thinking about how we think about what literature does. That
mm,
what that effectively does is reverses the way we usually thought about literature as being representational, as representing things, and thinking about, say, literature and machines or literature and animals as how we represent animals, how we represent machines, as opposed to imagining what it is like to see the world as another sees it, even if that other is not human.
mm,
And that's something quite different than representation.
mm, mm,
And and I think it's quite a radical way of thinking about
mm,
what literature
mm. Yeah, and I mean, I've become. I mean, this is a sort of difficult thought, but I've become fascinated by this kind of sense of space. As soon as
does.
you imagine yourself into someone else's position,
Yeah.
you're also representing a spatial difference between
Mhm.
you. So if and you can imagine what happens if I imagined I was a butterfly or something like
Mm.
that. You're sort of you've then got a different or an octopus, or
Mhm.
you've got a different sort of spatial relation. Something I like to do in my work is to think what happens if you sort of showed your workings in the sense of you still imagine the human subject doing this, sort of
Mm.
imagine the writer thinking about what it's like to be an octopus. There's a kind of spatial relationship there that just it starts to create a world, doesn't it? And starts
Mhm.
to and that the thinking about what it means to be human takes place in that space. So it's not necessarily, well, you can get the fact sheet on how octopuses
Yeah.
think and what they
Yeah.
do, why they're
Yeah.
intelligent and so on. But it's just that act of opening up a space in order to help you think about like what the other thing is, what
Yes.
who you
Yes.
are, what the relation is between those things.
Yeah.
And that's something, and that's what I mean by anthropomorphism. I think anthropomorphism, even though it has dangers, we can do that. We can
Mhm.
sort of, project into other things, and yeah, because there's arguments the other way, aren't there? Which we should probably talk about. I mean, does reading literature make us better people?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm not sure, and It definitely seems helpful to have these kind of acts of imaginative projection. Yeah.
Yeah, and that and that's something I think that the profession had given up on quite a long time ago.
Uh-huh.
The idea that reading literature actually makes us better people. I mean, it's the old Mac Reynolds thing that it makes us better.
Mm,
Um, but in fact, maybe there is an ethical side to this.
mm,
That to see the world not just as others see it, but as others with a big O.
mm,
Non-human others see it
mm.
um, has an ethical dimension.
I mean, at the center of this is the problem of anthropocentrism. That's the idea that we can only look
Yeah,
at things in terms
yeah,
of the human. And so, what a lot of people are thinking about today. So, I've moved from this field of literary animal studies now to human technology studies. How can we stop being so self-centered as
yeah,
a species?
yeah,
And, because as soon as you start to think about, what happens if you think about those camels in the
yeah,
desert? Like, would
yeah,
you develop the land a certain way, once those
yeah,
creatures are there. So as soon as you start to think about these other questions, then we sort of think about things less. So I do think it's something is really interesting. I ran a seminar a few months back at the NU called AI and Other Scientific Fables. I sort of we're talking about AI and something people picked up on that fable because of this connection I have with it. But so people said, yeah, this we have a moral problem here, like in relation to AI. And like
mm,
literature can help us with that because literature gives us. I was really surprised. These were
mm,
sort of
yeah,
non-literary
yeah,
people giving
yeah,
these answers, but saying that there's maybe a moral dimension
yeah,
to literature, which I think is important. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's great to end on a note where we sort of saved the profession, really.
Yes.
We're useful again.
That was
Yeah,
good
yeah,
work. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, so listen, Chris, thanks very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.